There's a whole lot of evil in the world. Ever since the beginning of time, evil has existed. History is full with tales of wicked people who've committed unspeakable crimes, even children. They've lived among us, and some still do, continuing to lure in their victims with charming and deceptive tactics. Their crimes are beyond comprehension. But for some strange reason, society has forever been fascinated with the lives of these sadistic individuals. What motivates someone to slaughter millions of people, or consume a person's rotting corpse? We serial killers are your sons, we are your husbands, we are everywhere. And there will be more of your children dead tomorrow, said serial killer Ted Bundy. He was the Grand Vizier of the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire from 1917 to 1918. In 1915, Talat declared an order to wipe out the Armenian race. People were whipped, tortured, robbed, RPD and killed. All of the Armenians were forced into concentration camps. People were overloaded with supplies and forced to trudge miles with no food, and they were killed if they couldn't continue. People were naked when they marched. The whole male population of Angora was exterminated. Many were forced to sexual abuse family members. People were killed by bayonets, clubs, axes, hammers, spades, scythes, and saws. Many had their private parts and sexual organs cut off. Tens of thousands were burned, drowned, poisoned, dismembered, crucified, boiled and beaten to death. Out of the population of 2.5 million Armenians, 1 to 1.5 million people were killed. Talat was assassinated in 1921 by an Armenian assassination squad. He was a physician in the concentration camp Auschwitz and the doctor known as the Angel of Death. He was in charge of selecting Jews to be sent to concentration camps or to be killed. He practiced many experiments on people. One of the most common experiments was on twins. He would find the similarities and differences in the genetics of twins, as well as seeing if the humane body could be manipulated. There were about 3,000 twins, only 200 survived. The twins were arranged by sex and age. During the experiment, he would pour chemicals into the eyes of the twins to see if it would change their colors into sewing them together in hope to create conjoined twins. He sometimes tried to change the sex of the twins. He sometimes forced parents to kill their children. He tortured children to see how long they could survive. He often beat prisoners to death personally. He sent over 400,000 people to their deaths in the gas chambers. Mengele escaped with his family to South America and lived there the rest of his life. It is possible that he used 88 twins in his medical experiments there. He died from a stroke in 1985 while swimming in the Brazilian Ocean. Heinrich Himmler was the head of the SS, the second most powerful Nazi and the architect of the final solution. He, more than anyone, encouraged and facilitated Adolf Hitler's decision to implement the final solution to the Jewish question, as well as other programs of ethnic cleansing that destroyed millions of lives during World War II. He was responsible for 6 to 7 million deaths of Poles, Russians, Communists, and other groups whom the Nazis deemed unworthy to live, including people with physical and mental disabilities. Himmler once said the decision, therefore, lies here in the East. Here must the Russian enemy, this people numbering 200 million Russians, be killed on the battlefield and person by person, and made to bleed to death. His house contained furniture and books made from the bones and skins of his Jewish victims. Himmler committed suicide in 1945 by eating poison. Adolf Eichmann was the architect of the Holocaust. He was in charge of rounding up Jews into and forcing them into ghettos and concentration camps. He was responsible for day-to-day organization of the final solution. He organized the registration, cremation and transport of Europe's Jews. From May until July 1944, Eichmann organized the deportation and murder of more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews. He was responsible for 5 to 6 million Jewish deaths. He would leap into his grave laughing because the feeling that he had 5 million Jews he killed filled his heart with gladness and joy. He once said that he would even kill his father if he was ordered to do so. He escaped and made his way to Argentina and lived under the name Ricardo Clement for 15 years. He was captured in May 1960. Israeli security captured him and took him to trial. He was tried for 15 charges and hanged. He was the leader of the French Revolution. Before he became a tyrant, he wanted the people of France to have freedom and rights, but when he gained power his personality changed and he became obsessed with guillotining people. He began to create a reign of terror, a 10-month period in which mass executions were carried out. He also began to see everyone, including friends, as enemies. People were guillotined for not supporting the French Revolution, hoarding, desertion, rebellion, and other things he saw as crimes. He guillotined entire families of aristocrats and ordinary people. He even guillotined his closest friends. Most were killed without trials. As many as 40,000 were either executed or died in prison, including King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. He was also responsible for hundreds of thousands that died in battles during the Revolution. Under his orders, his men attacked Vendée, killing well over 100,000 men, women and children. He believed that killing people was better than forgiving people. Ultimately, in 1794, Robespierre was guillotined without trial. He was dictator of North Korea from 1948 to 1972. Kim Il-sung started the Korean War, which killed 3 million people. After the war, he brainwashed the people of North Korea into idolizing him, even though he made the country a lot worse than it was before. He killed all of his officers and rivals. In addition, he exiled or executed 90% of his generals that fought in the war. More than 200,000 political prisoners were forced into concentration camps. People were forced into concentration camps for something as little as dropping a picture of Kim Il-sung accidentally on the ground. If someone committed a crime, the person's children and the children's children would also be killed or sentenced to life imprisonment. Prisoners were starved, tortured or worked to death. Prisoners were sometimes forced to kneel in a box motionless for months until he or she dies. Hundreds of thousands were killed by firing squads and in concentration camps. Of the population of 22 million Koreans, 900,000 to 3.5 million have died in a famine. Kim Il-sung died in 1994 of a heart attack, which was brought on by a row with his son Kim Jong-il, who has proven that he is worse than his father. He was the religious leader of Iran from 1979 to 1989. He was also the leader of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which killed 3,000 to 60,000 people. The Shia Islamic law had a lot of harsh rules for the normal people. Men and women had strict dress codes, citizens lost equal rights and met with very harsh punishments, were brutalized, tortured and killed. People were imprisoned and tortured for listening to music. People were lashed 100 times for kissing in public. People were tortured and killed if they did not believe in Allah. People were shot, hanged, blinded, gassed, stabbed in the chest, stoned to death and burned alive. People had their hands cut off for stealing. Women had their faces slashed or burnt by acid. People were killed by machine guns, knives, clubs, cutters, and acid. In the 1988 Iranian massacres, Khomeini ordered that every prisoner that did not repent anti-regime activities should be killed. About 30,000 people were killed in 5 months, while thousands of others were killed for other reasons, including children that were hanged from cranes. His followers held 52 Americans captive for 444 days, but there were others there for 6 years. They were blindfolded most of the time. They might have suffered a fate worse than death. He spread his ways across the Middle East. Saddam Hussein feared the spread of Khomeini's militant brand of Shiism, so he attacked Iran, which started the Iran-Iraq War, which caused the deaths of 1 to 2 million people. During the war, Khomeini sent young boys to fight and refused to make peace with Iraq, even though there was at least one moment when Saddam offered peace for Iran. Because Khomeini refused to settle peace, Iran's economy was ruined and 500,000 to 1 million Iranians were killed. His hatred of America and Western society inspired and paved the way for terrorist groups including Al-Qaeda. He paved the way for the Islamic Holy War, which has killed more than 2 million people. Khomeini died from cancer in 1989. He was Emperor of Japan from 1926 to 1989. In that time he and his army committing many war crimes and killed countless numbers of Chinese, Indonesians, Koreans, Filipinos, and Indo-Chinese. He ordered every Chinese war prisoner to be killed. About 200,000 women were sexually assaulted. Husbands were sometimes forced to sexual assault their wives and daughters. A total of 10 million Chinese were forced into slavery, many were tortured and some even eaten. Many people were shot, beheaded, stabbed, burned, boiled, roasted, buried alive, and impaled. People were sometimes killed by gas, aid, military dogs, and being hanged by their tongues on iron hooks. People were often used for bayonet practice. Between 4 and 10 million people in Java were forced to work by Japanese military, the majority of which died. People sometimes had their bodies sliced in half by a sword. Women were often stabbed by a bayonet or a long stick of bamboo through private parts. The Japanese disemboweled, decapitated, hacked, nailed, crucified and dismembered men. Men and women sometimes had their private parts sliced open. Thousands were frozen to death. 4 million people in Indonesia died from famine and 2 million in Vietnam. Thousands were killed by chemical attacks. About 400,000 were killed by diseases. About 580,000 were killed after being human experiments. The Sukching massacre killed 50,000 to 90,000 Chinese. 100,000 civilians in the Philippines died from the Manila Massacre. His men said that it was easy to kill because Hirohito told them that their lives were valueless compared to himself. He told his men to kill, burn, and loot all Chinese. Over 20 million Chinese, 10 million Asians in other countries, and millions of people in World War II were killed by the Japanese. He died in 1989 from cancer. Nero was Rome's fifth emperor from AD 54 to AD 68. He brought the Roman Empire to ruin. He burned entire cities. He murdered thousands of people, including his aunt, stepsister, ex-wife, mother, wife, and adoptive brother. He systematically murdered every member in his family. Some were killed in searing hot baths. He poisoned, beheaded, stabbed, burned, boiled, crucified, and impaled people. He often RPD women and cut off the veins and private parts of both men and women. He is said to have fiddled while Rome was burning. The Great Fire killed many of Rome's citizens and left hundreds of thousands destitute. Though Nero probably started the fire, he blamed it on the Christians. Christians were starved to death, burned, torn by dogs, fed to lions, crucified, used as torches, and nailed to crosses. He was so bad that many of the Christians thought he was the Antichrist. He even tortured and killed the Apostle Paul and the disciple Peter. Paul was beheaded and Peter was crucified upside down. Nero committed suicide when he realized he was losing the rebellion and his life was in danger. He was Rome's third emperor from AD 37 to AD 41. He was wild, extravagant, with a penchant for sexual adventures. In the first 3 months in his reign of terror, over 160,000 animals were sacrificed in his honor. He later got a brain fever that made him mentally ill. He then believed he was a god. Under Caligula, the law became an instrument of torture. He believed prisoners should feel a painful death. He began to brutally murder for fun. He would kill his opponents slowly and painfully over hours or days. He decapitated and strangled children. People were beaten with heavy chains. He forced families to attend their children's execution. Many people had their tongues cut off. He fed prisoners to lions, panthers, and bears, and often killed gladiators. One gladiator alone was beaten up for 2 days, full days. He sometimes ordered people to be killed by elephants. His cruelty caused people to commit suicide. He demanded sexual intercourse with a lot of women, including his 3 sisters. He would force husbands to give up their wives. He exiled his sisters and had his brother-in-law put to death. He caused many to die of starvation. Sawing people was one of his favorite things to do, which filleted the spine and spinal cord from crotch down to the chest. He liked to chew up the testicles of victims. He killed some of his most important friends and his father-in-law. One time Caligula said, "I wish Rome had but one neck, so that I could cut off all their heads with one blow." In AD 41, Caligula was killed by Cassius Correa, a man whom Caligula had mocked at court for his effeminacy. Attila ruled the Huns from 434 to 453. He was the leader of the Hunnic Empire, which stretched from the Ural River to Germany and from the Baltic Sea to the Danube River. He was a bloodthirsty, cruel, and ruthless barbarian that was a lover of battle. He wanted to destroy the Roman Empire and everyone in his way. If you were a citizen in Rome and begged for mercy, he would kill you. He was as great a menace to the Teutonic tribespeople as he was to the Romans. He was so destructive that people believed he was a punishment from heaven. His nickname was Attila, the Scourge of God. Attila and the other Huns thought that other people's lives were meaningless. He would torture and destroy his enemies, his own people, and entire population of cities. He rampaged Roman cities and may have killed up to hundreds of thousands. People were sometimes torn limb by limb. One time Attila found Saint Ursula, the perpetual virgin, and wanted to marry her. She refused, which made Attila angry and had her killed along with 11,000 of her companions. It is said that he might have drunk a woman's blood. He ate 2 of his sons and killed his brother. Attila coughed up blood and died in 453. He was Khan of the Mongolian Empire from 1206 to 1227. In that time he conquered most of China and all the land through the Caspian Sea. He was ruthless, vengeful, cruel, and bloodthirsty. He and his army destroyed countless numbers of cities, solders, civilians, and children. People were killed by having molten metal and silver poured into their eyes and ears. In one massacre alone, 700,000 people were killed. At another place, the poor were decapitated and the rich were tortured to find out where their treasure was. Women were sometimes raped in front of their families. Hundreds of thousands had their lives ruined. It is said that if his army of men had no water, they would cut a horse's vein and drink its blood. He would use people as human shields. Tens of thousands became slaves. He would order you to be killed immediately if you were an enemy, if you betrayed him or if you were disloyal to him. Genghis and his army killed 20 to 60 million people. He killed 3/4 of the population of the Iranian plateau, which was 10 to 15 million. He also killed his brother at age 13 just because his brother had stolen a fish from him. Genghis Khan once said the greatest happiness is to scatter your enemy, to drive him before you, to see his cities reduced to ashes, to see those who love him shrouded in tears, and to gather into your bosom his wives and daughters. Genghis Khan died of natural causes in 1227. He was king of Belgium from 1865 to 1909. He ruled the Congo Free State, which was a private project, from 1885 to 1908. The Congo Free State was 76 times larger than Belgium. He is considered one of the greatest liars of all time because he fooled the whole world that he was helping the Congo and the world believed him. Instead, he turned the Congo into a country ruled by forced labor. He was free to rule the Congo Free State as a personal domain. Leopold ruled about 20 million Congolese. Under his administration, the Congo Free State was subject to a terror regime. The Congo Free State also became one of the most infamous international scandals of the turn of the century. His men tortured, maimed, and slaughtered millions of Congolese. Congolese were killed if they did not bring enough rubber. Hundreds of thousands of people had their hands, legs, feet, arms, heads, ears, and noses cut off. Many villages were burned and the natives forced to flee into the jungle. Leopold's men RPD, flogged and eat the natives. They slaughtered hundreds of thousands of children. More than 500,000 died from various diseases. A few million died of starvation. Leopold killed around 10 million Congolese. Before Leopold acquired the Congo Free State, most African countries were free countries, but within 30 years after Leopold acquired the Congo Free State, all but 2 African countries were taken by European countries. He did all of this just to get more money. Leopold died in 1909. Torquemada was the Grand Inquisitor of Spain from 1483 to 1498. He started the Spanish Inquisition, which was established on November 1, 1478 and disbanded in July 15, 1834. The Spanish Inquisition was an ecclesiastical tribunal run by the Spanish monarchy and established to root out heretics and other individuals who threatened the status of Roman Catholic Church in Spain. Torquemada's spies turned friends against friends and they made sons and daughters testify against their parents. Torquemada without lack of evidence would order Jews to be tortured or killed because of his discrimination towards them. Countless of people were tortured, whipped, subjected to horrific physical punishments, and forced to surrender all of their property. Children sometimes died from starvation. People were often naked when they were tortured. Torquemada favored many forms of torture like foot roasting and suffocation. People were sometimes burned alive, hanged, and grilled. Some ways of torture often went through sexual organs. One way to torture people was the garucha, which pulled a prisoner's arms and legs from their sockets. Another way of torturing Jews was the toka, a water torture, which was when water was forced down the victim's throat. Another method was the portu, which used tight cords to stop blood from flowing. Another method was the turtle, which was when victims were crushed with heavy weights. Another method was when a victim would be pushed into a garroting chair, which had a sharp point in the neck region. Another method was the rack, which stretched a person's body a foot or more. Then an inquisitor would rip off the victim's nipples, tongue, ears, nose, and genitals. Some people were skinned from their head to their waist. 2,000 to 10,000 Jews suffered death by being burned on stakes and more than 9,000 were punished by other methods. Many Jews died from starvation. By one account, he killed over 30,000 people. Torquemada's hatred of heretics influenced King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to expel every Jew or Muslim that had not embraced Christianity, which was 200,000 to 300,000. Most of them had ancestors that have lived in Spain for centuries. It is said that Torquemada himself had Jewish blood in him. Torquemada died of old age in 1478. Mao Zedong was dictator of China from 1943 to 1976. Mao's plan was to make China a superpower country. Mao also said he would turn China into a powerful country that could match the United States and the Soviet Union. In the process, however, he created the greatest famine and genocide in history. Under Mao's rule, China endured a series of economic disasters and political terrorism. Millions of Chinese died by execution, starvation, and committing suicide. Tens of millions were sent to labor camps. 5 million were executed. Mao turned neighbors against neighbors and sons and daughters against their teachers and parents. Mao used fear to root out every last hint of dissent. A criticism uttered in private could lead to public humiliation, torture, or death. The famine killed about 30 to 45 million people. Millions died from disease. Another 700,000 committed suicide out of fear of Mao. Mao led two great leap forwards, which was a plan to use China's vast population to rapidly transform the country from a rural economy into a modern communist society. Both combined killed 40 to 50 million people. Millions of children were also killed. If children stole food, they would have their fingers chopped off. Mao once led a revolution that everyone in China was supposed to accept, but if you opposed the revolution, you would either be imprisoned for many years, tortured or executed. People were expected to work till they dropped. People were beaten up and tortured if they could not do their work and if they were late going to work. People were also beaten up if they said something that made Mao or his men angry. Mao's brutal men had methods of torture like whipping, burning people with incense or with flame of a kerosene lamp, and nailing a person's palms to a table and then to insert bamboo splints under fingernails. Mao killed 70 million people. Mao died in 1976 after suffering from a nervous system disease. Ivan was Tsar of Russia from 1533 to 1584. Ivan was cruel, brutal and merciless even as a kid. When he was young, he had habits of taking creatures like dogs, cats, bears, and other creatures to the top of tall buildings and then throwing them to the ground. Ivan killed people when he was a teenager. Ivan found them fun and amusing. When Ivan became Tsar of Russia, he became paranoid and started to see enemies everywhere. Ivan forced thousands to move from their lands and made them homeless. Ivan became obsessed with killing and torturing anyone he saw as enemies, but most were innocent people. Ivan destroyed hundreds of villages, towns and cities. In the Novgorod massacre, 60,000 were tortured to death. Ivan had his own personal torture chamber. Ivan tortured and destroyed entire families. Hundreds of parents were forced to see their children tortured and killed. Ivan ordered hundreds of people to be eaten by bears and wolves. He personally killed and tortured people with his long and hard staff. If Ivan ordered someone to be killed, he would often want to watch the execution. Some of his executions were as long as 15 hours. He enjoyed seeing people's blood and suffering from being tortured. Ivan ordered people to be beheaded, strangled, hanged, blinded, burned, stabbed, boiled, disemboweled, buried alive, impaled and fried. Ivan would often remove people's ribs with red-hot pincers. Peasant girls were often tortured, whipped, RPD and used for target practice. Religious leaders were tortured and killed if they begged Ivan to stop his killings. He blinded his architect and boiled his treasurer. Ivan killed one of his wives a day after their marriage. He even killed his favorite son in a rage. Ivan died while he was playing chess with one of his friends in 1584. Most likely he was poisoned. Amin was dictator of Uganda from 1971 to 1979. Amin charmed and promised the world that he would bring peace and democracy to the people of his country. Instead, he turned Uganda into a poverty-stricken land patrolled by death squads. Amin was possibly the most brutal and merciless dictator of all time. His rule was characterized by human rights abuses, ethnic persecution, political repression, massacres and the expulsion of 80,000 Asians from Uganda. Amin pitted his people and executed hundreds of thousands of his people. Amin was probably the most sadistic dictator in the 20th century. He would show executions of people on television. Amin tortured and killed his country's soldiers, government officials, teachers, artists, doctors, journalists, engineers, politicians, police officers, photographers, lawyers, business people, ordinary citizens, ministers and children. Amin's men tortured and killed people with sledgehammers while Amin kept the pictures for fun and amusement. Amin often had his victims buried alive. Amin would often give the heads of his enemies to crocodiles. Hundreds of thousands of dead bodies washed up to the shores of Lake Victoria. Amin killed 4,000 people by throwing them into crocodile-infested rivers. About 50,000 people died from disease, most were children. He would cut the flesh of people and force them to eat it until they died. Amin ate human flesh and he said proudly that he was a cannibal. He also drank human blood. Amin mutilated one of his wives and had her limbs sewn upside down. Amin killed and tortured 300,000 to 500,000 Ugandans. Amin was forced in exile in Saudi Arabia for the rest of his life. Amin died almost 25 years later in 2003. In that time Amin lived a very peaceful life. Pol Pot was Prime Minister of Cambodia from 1976 to 1979. His plan was to destroy the civilization of Cambodia and turn it into a new age. He turned Cambodia into a killing field. Pol Pot is the only man in history that ordered an official genocide against his whole country, and he killed the greatest percentage in the amount of time he was in power. He declared that the Buddhist religion, money, and personal possessions would all be banned. His communist government forced mass evacuations of cities. Millions of Cambodians were displaced, tortured and killed. People were separated from friends and families. People died from effects of slave labor, malnutrition, poor medical care, starvation and execution. Hundreds of thousands were clubbed to death and buried alive. Thousands were killed from disease and torture. Many were hanged. Millions of people, including the elderly, pregnant women, and children, would stand in water up to their necks in cold and rainy seasons, working on canals, with legs and feet swelling up and bleeding. If you stopped working because of illness, you would not be fed or you would be killed. If a worker made a mistake, he or she would be flogged to death or shot. You would be expected to work until you dropped dead. Many people had no rights to eat. If people were found eating dead humans, they would be buried alive. Pol Pot wanted teenagers to become solders with a love of killing. If Cambodian people married people of Vietnam, the husband and wife would be killed. People that spoke and looked like Vietnamese were also killed. Pol Pot often ordered people to kill and fight Vietnamese. He took pictures of the people he executed and recorded them in detail. Prisoners were forced to drink humane urine. He ordered babies to be torn limb by limb. People were beaten to death by blunt instruments like hammers, spades and axe handles. People were also killed by sharpened bamboo sticks. Some of his men killed people by bleeding them to death. He liked to keep the skulls of dead people. To Pol Pot, his people's lives were not just cheap, but of no value at all. He killed 1 to 3 million Cambodians, 25 to 33% of the country. Pol Pot died in April in 1998 of natural causes. Hitler was Chancellor of Germany from 1933 to his death in 1945, becoming Germany's Führer. Before he gained power, he wanted to be an artist, but he failed. Then he decided that he wanted to be a member of the German army. He became soldier in World War I. When the German army surrendered, Hitler escaped and returned to Germany. He believed that Germany lost because they had surrendered, and it made him bitter. He then turned his attention to the Jews. He believed that the Jews were the cause of Germany's problems, and he also believed that the Jews did not count as human beings. His plans were to eliminate every Jew in Europe and to gain world control. He once said, by the skillful and sustained use of propaganda, one can make a people see even heaven as hell or an extremely wretched life as paradise. Hitler would kill any Jew, enemy, or anyone that he thought was a problem. He used wounded people that were in hospitals for test experiments for ways of killing, like carbon dioxide gas. These experiments killed over 300,000 people. Every Jew in Germany was sent to concentration camps. Jews in other countries were also sent to concentration camps. All were expected to work until they died or they were killed. Millions of Jews had to watch friends and members of their families die. Jews died from gas chambers, crematories, firing squads, lethal injections, forced labor, starvation, poison, exposure, disease, execution, death marches and medical experiments. More than 90% of Poland's Jews were killed. Millions of children died because of him. Hitler betrayed friends and allies in the war. Hitler had a breeding program. If the child fell short of Nazi-defined perfection, the child would be killed. Hitler himself was responsible for the deaths of more than 11 million people, but his actions caused the deaths of over 50 million people. On 1945, Hitler committed suicide by gunshot and cyanide poisoning. Stalin was dictator of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1953. When he was young, he was a bank robber, an agitator, and an assassin. After a long road to get into power, he became a paranoid, ruthless, unforgiving, brutal, and vengeful dictator. He created a 30-year reign of violence, terror, destruction, and murdering. Anyone who spied on him, displeased him, or voted against him was doomed to die. His first plan was to create the Soviet Union into an industrial superpower country. To do that would cause the deaths of countless numbers of people. People were sent to slave labors and were forced to work to death. Huge industrial schemes became a living hell for hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions. He signed the death warrants for tens of thousands of people. Stalin only liked people who fulfilled his orders, but if you were a popular figure, an intelligent and independent person, Stalin would order you to be tortured, imprisoned for many years or life, or shot you. He would kill family members of people who loved him and family members of people who honored him as a god. Stalin once kissed a small girl in public. She had become famous and thought Stalin cared for her and her family, but he later killed her parents. People were sometimes killed with an ice pick. About 10 million people died in a famine. Stalin once said, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is simply a statistic." He killed the wives of some of his friends. He exiled his daughter's boyfriend, Alexei Kapler. Stalin's wife was driven into despair by his treatment of her, which caused her to kill herself. His son died in a Nazi concentration camp after Stalin refused to trade for his life. He would even kill people who were defending their country against the Nazis. People who were in prison were forced to fight in World War II, but if they returned they would be sent back to prison. Hundreds of thousands of people from other countries were tortured, raped, or killed. People were often killed by mustard gas bombs. More than 1.5 million German women were RPD from the Soviet Union. Recent evidence shows that Stalin had his own final solution in which hundreds of thousands of Jews were exiled or killed. Stalin wanted the Soviet Union to become a country strong enough to rival the US, but if they were stronger than the US, he would want the two countries to fight a war. Stalin killed 20 to 60 million people. He died in 1953 from a stroke. Vlad was Prince of Wallachia a total of 3 times, in the years 1448, 1456 to 1462, and 1476. He is best known for inspiring the Dracula legend, the cruel methods he used to torture and kill people and how much he enjoyed killing people. His last name, Dracula, means little devil. The most common method he used to kill people was impalement. Vlad had a horse attached to each of the victim's legs and a sharpened stake was gradually forced into the body. The end of the stake was usually oiled and care was taken that the stake was not beta sharp. Normally the stake was inserted into the body through the buttocks and was often forced through the body until it emerged from the mouth. However, there were many times where victims were impaled through other bodily orifices or through the abdomen or chest. He was so fond of doing this that he is now known as Vlad the Impaler. The height of the stake ranked the victim. Vlad also loved to impale animals. It was possibly of the most gruesome and painful way of dying in history. Victims would endure this for hours or days. Everyone in the city Amlas, including every children, went through this, which was up to 20,000 people. Vlad did not want the stake to be too sharp because the victim would die too soon and it would not be as much fun to watch. He would impale children and babies through their mothers' chests. Impalement was his favorite way of killing people, but it was not his only method. Vlad ordered people to be poisoned, blinded, strangled, hanged, decapitated, stabbed, disemboweled, skinned, exposed to extreme elements and animals, hacked, dismembered, burned, boiled, scalped, roasted, nailed in the head, buried alive, etc. He would like to cut off people's noses, ears, hands, feet, limbs, and sexual organs. He often cut off people's private parts and would keep them. People were sometimes worked to death. He also smashed the heads of people into hard walls. He liked to eat and drink around bodies of dead and naked people that had stakes through them. He destroyed many of his villages on his way into battles. He roasted children and forced their parents to eat them. Vlad hated people who were sick, weak, poor, beggars or vagrants. He invited all of the poor and sick of Wallachia to a fake party. He asked them if they wished to be anything other than poor people. When they all said yes, they were all burned immediately. He murdered his wife and had her sexual organs cut off. There were rumors that Vlad loved to drink blood. Vlad killed over 100,000 people. If that is true, he killed 20% of Wallachia's population. Nearly all of those people went through horrible ways of killing that would take a long time. Vlad was decapitated in 1476.